In the movie business, they don't just grab a camera and start filming without a plan. When it comes to podcasting, we can save a ton of time and money by taking some time to think through our video podcast first. And that's what we're going to do in this video, break down some of the key things that you should know before starting your video podcast. And the first thing that you should know about video podcasting is it can take a ton of time, and that might cost you more than you want it to. Of course, money isn't everything. And I'm not just talking about money with those costs. Creating a podcast just for fun is a valid and extremely popular thing to do. But even if you don't care about making money from your podcast, even if you're podcasting as a hobby, just like any hobby, well, it all takes time. And we could just as easily paraphrase the saying, time is money, to simply say, time is valuable. What do you find valuable? Well, let's be realistic about this, because we all have the same 24 hours in a day. And when you start a video podcast, that's going to take time away from anything else that you have going on in your life. That's why I believe it's important to always be aware of how much time you're spending on your podcast, because that's really how you're going to know if the value that you get out of your podcast is worth what you're spending on it, even if all you're spending on it is time. So before you start your video podcast, I would highly recommend that you start tracking your time. If you've never done that before, here is a very practical way to do that easily. Grab a notepad and pen and just keep it by your podcasting setup. Whenever you sit down, jot down the time and a little description of what you're going to do. It'll also be helpful if you put your time entries into projects, maybe one for audio and one for video. Then do whatever you're going to do and then jot down the time when you stop. Now, if you're like me, you might prefer a digital time tracker. But if you need to place a start, my personal favorite app that I've used for years is an app called Toggl, Toggl. The specific tool that you use to track your time is not as important as the fact that you're getting into the habit of doing it, of tracking your time. And then once a week, review that time log to see how much time you've spent on your podcast and what you've done. Personally, I review my time every Monday morning, and then you can see how much of that time spent correlates to just the video, like maybe setting up the lighting or getting yourself camera ready, and then how much of that correlates to the audio side. I would recommend at least 5 or 6 episodes worth of data points for this after you're comfortable with the editing side, because it'll always take more time to learn something new. So if you're new to editing overall, then that's going to just naturally take more time. But don't stop tracking your time even after you get comfortable, because the goal here isn't to know how much time it takes you to learn the video podcasting side. The goal is to get enough data to know how long it takes to create your podcast audio and how much time it takes to do the video. Since video has audio, every type of podcast has audio. So when you track your time, tag the entries that are video only, and that will help you realistically know what you're getting into. Because if you think it only takes an hour a week, and then you find out that it's actually taking 5 or 6 hours, that mismatch of expectations between how long you think something will take and how long it really takes, that's a fast track to getting burned out. Now, you'll notice that I'm talking about multiple episodes. So yes, this will take some time to gather your data points. My recommendation is if you start a video podcast, set a deadline for it. Make it obvious for your audience that this is a trial of the video, because your audience will always be happy to keep the video if you find out you have enough time to do that video, but you can stop doing the video if it turns out to be taking too long. And at the end of the day, if you are stretching yourself so thin that doing video ends up getting you burned out, well, then your audience isn't going to have any content at all. And they'd rather have audio than nothing, right? In fact, burning out is so common in the podcasting space that long-term podcasters even came up with a term for it, pod fading. It's when a podcast just fades away. And one of the most popular reasons for pod fading is when a podcaster starts the show and then starts to hit a wall where they get overwhelmed with how much work it actually is. But you can avoid that by being realistic with yourself and how much time you have. Think of it kind of like when you go fishing. That's a hobby that can take a lot of time, but do you really care if you catch a ton of fish at the end of the day, or did you just have fun spending that time doing something you love? There's no right or wrong answer here because we're all different. But the point with tracking your time is to start gathering a log of how much time you're actually dedicating to your podcast. Because regardless of whether this is a new hobby or a new business for you, a month or two down the road, you're going to be able to look back and then you'll be able to quantify if the time that you're pouring into this new podcast is really worth it to you. As much as we want to compete with everyone around us, you don't actually have to publish an episode every single week. You don't have to publish YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, TikToks, or whatever other social platforms keep trying to tell us that we need to do to be successful. It's your podcast. You set the schedule, which means you need to be realistic about what works for your schedule. Not mine, not Joe Rogan's, not anyone else's. And here's a little pro tip about your schedule. It can change. You can start with a weekly schedule, and if that's too much work, then you can start to adjust to maybe fortnightly or monthly. When you're creating great content, your podcast audience will love to hear whatever it is you have to say whenever it comes out. So they'll thank you for building your podcast around a schedule that will ensure that you can keep the podcast coming out instead of getting yourself burnt out and never publishing anything ever again. And that leads me right into the next thing that you should know before starting your video podcast. You don't really need to do video. Statistics will always change. It's what they do. But one key thing that hasn't changed since podcasting started is that audio podcasts have always outperformed video podcasts. That might be surprising since huge companies like YouTube and Spotify keep trying to tell us that video is the thing to do. But sometimes it's just easier to listen to a podcast when you're driving or doing chores around the house instead of watching a podcast. Think of it kind of like listening to music instead of watching a music video. Do you always have to watch a music video? Or do you usually listen to music and sometimes you'll watch the video? And I'm not here to combat the differences between whether or not YouTube is a video podcast or not. But when you're starting a podcast, none of that should matter to you because all this means is there's a massive audience of podcast listeners out there who love audio. And this is another statistic that will always change, but the general rule of thumb is it takes about 4 times as long to produce video content as it does to produce audio content. If you really think about that, it makes sense. With video content, you also have to think about the camera, the lighting, on-screen graphics, which means now you have to think about your brand style and colors and all those visual things that you don't really have to worry about when you're doing audio. So here's the practical side of this. Go back to your time log and next to the log, make a note of what you did tied to audio or video, kind of what I talked about before. Was this something related to the video setting up like the camera and the lights? It's not just about recording. It's all about the setup too. And this doesn't have to be accurate down to the second, but if you get into the habit of jotting things down in the time log, as well as a rough summary of what you did, then as you review those time logs, you'll start to get a sense for how much time you're spending on just the video and just the audio that has nothing to do with the video. And then that's going to help you decide if you even need to do video right now. Or maybe you start with an audio podcast and then you add a video component later. Or maybe you start with video and audio, and then as you're tracking your time, you realize, I really don't have time for video, and that's when you switch back to audio only. Okay, to recap, we learned some of the key things to keep in mind before starting a video podcast. And it really boils down to the time it takes and finding practical ways to make sure you actually have the time for it. There are millions of podcast listeners out there who prefer audio. There are millions of podcast watchers out there who prefer video. Your best chance at finding an audience that loves your podcast is by continuing to make your podcast. And that means you should be realistic about how much time you have. That's also why I highly recommend getting in the habit of time tracking now, because life situations can change. Hopefully, you're going to be podcasting for years to come. And who knows what other things can happen in your life during that time. When you have a more realistic perspective of how much time it takes, that's going to help you know how many episodes of audio or audio and video that you can produce each week, each month, or whatever your best production schedule looks like. Again, this is your podcast. You are in charge, so you make the rules of the content that you create. Okay, so with all of that in mind, let's move on to our next video where we're going to start the process of setting up for our video podcast, which actually starts with the audio. So see you there.